As we go through the text, it might be very wise to keep lists of the characters and notice how they connect one to the next. We also might be very well advised to keep perhaps a journal separately where we analyze the various characters like Elizabeth and Darcy primarily. Things will come up during the text that will show us aspects of their character, develop themes, create connections between them and other characters throughout. Here in chapter 24, the beginning of the second section of the work, we have the introduction to the family of very important characters, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. Before we have them introduced in the text, we have a conversation between Jane and Elizabeth about the nature of love and relationships and marriage. And it's important that we go and look at that conversation here in chapter 24. Jane says, first and foremost, to Elizabeth, that she wishes that her mother had more command over herself. She says, she can have no idea of the pain she gives me by her continual reflections. And Elizabeth realizes at that point that she's not the only one who has thought that her mother perhaps is a bit imprudent, and she sees that she doesn't want to be like that. So Jane has pointed out something that perhaps Elizabeth has thought of as well. It's interesting to note that Jane Austen creates characters here in the Bennett girls, that all of them are, in a way, aspects of the same character, but they're isolated aspects. So, for instance, Jane is all goodness and good thought and purity, and she has not a base idea in her. She's also very trusting, overly trusting, but all her thoughts are good thoughts. She's never dark or brooding or boring or any of that sort of thing. She's just very quiet and very noble. You could say, in a way, she's almost like she's the cerebral part of the human person, the metaphysical part. Mary, on the other hand, is the moralizing part, the part that wants to make judgments on other people and wants to dive into books only. And consequently, she's very dull and very boring. Kitty and Lydia, in a way, represent the baser aspects of the human person. They're almost like the carnal desire for men at any cost whatsoever. Well, that comes out something in this conversation. Elizabeth is, in a way, trying to cultivate all these aspects of the human person. And she says to her sister, "You wish to think all the world respectable, and are hurt if I speak ill of anybody. There are few people whom I really love, and still fewer of whom I think well. The more I see of the world, the more am I dissatisfied with it, and every day confirms my belief of the inconsistencies of all human characters, and of all the little dependence that can be placed on the appearance of merit or sense." Elizabeth, in this case, is indicating that she's becoming more and more bitter, that she doesn't see among human beings this constancy or reliability, and she doesn't see anybody that she can actually rely on. And in this instance, therefore, she's very much like Darcy. Darcy is becoming more bitter about the world and seeing less of human nature that he actually admires in the same way that Elizabeth is. So both of them are in a crisis situation where they could be risking their happiness. Jane even says this. She says, "My dear Lizzie, do not give way to such feelings as these. They will ruin your happiness." And that's something that is brought up during the course of the text. If Elizabeth is to see the world correctly, she's got to remove herself from the opinions and prejudices of society. But if she does this, she will risk in some ways becoming more bitter, because that's the flip side of removing yourself from that society. It's pride. It's thinking that you are aloof, that everybody else is terrible and you yourself are noble. Well, as the conversation unfolds here in 24, there is a statement made by Jane where she says, "We must not be so ready to fancy ourselves intentionally injured. We must not expect a lively young man to be always so guarded and circumspect. It is very often nothing but our own vanity that deceives us. Women fancy admiration means more than it does." Which is true. Jane seems to be pointing out something true. Frequently women, it seems, according to Jane Austen, fancy admiration means more than it does. If a man spends time talking to a woman, frequently the woman will say, "Oh, he likes me," more than he actually does, according to Jane Austen. And Elizabeth says, men take care that they should. In other words, men intentionally do that. They lead women on. Men are cruel in that way. And so Elizabeth is falling into this bitterness, especially against men, a misogyny, where she is disliking men and the human race in general. We'll enter into this, then, the character of Mrs. Gardiner. This is one quarter through the text, and Jane Austen introduces at this point this new character of Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. And she says here in chapter 25, on the following Monday, Mrs. Bennett had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, who came as usual to spend the Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sister, as well by nature as education. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennett and Mrs. Phillips, was an amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favorite with all her Longbourn nieces. Between the two eldest, and herself especially, there subsisted a particular regard. They had frequently been staying with her in town. First thing to note is that the text itself says that Mr. Gardiner is sensible and gentlemanlike. He is not Mr. Bennett, very different from Mr. Bennett, and also different from Mrs. Bennett as well. Mrs. Gardiner is also very amiable and intelligent, it says. She is elegant, and she is held in great regard by the daughters. She's closer in age, actually, to Jane and to Elizabeth than she is to Mrs. Bennett. Probably, I would suspect, she's in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, so only maybe a 10-year difference at the most. Consequently, she's more like them in age, but she's also admired by them because of her sensibility. In many respects, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, then, become kind of the surrogate parents for Elizabeth, because her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, are so unadmirable. They offer what a bad marriage might look like. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner become the surrogates that advise and counsel Elizabeth and guide her towards becoming a happy individual. Well, in a conversation between Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth is talking about Mr. Bingley, and Mrs. Gardiner says, "A young man such as you describe, Mr. Bingley, so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks, and when accident separates them, so easily forgets her that these sort of inconstancies are very frequent." She's suggesting here that the type of character that we're dealing with Bingley is rather shallow. It doesn't have any staying power. Remember, this is exactly what Darcy said earlier. Darcy says this very thing about Bingley when they're talking about the way that Bingley writes, and he's so proud of the way he writes so quickly. Mrs. Gardiner is noticing the same thing as Darcy, but it's also pointing out something which Elizabeth is beginning to learn how to do, which is to judge character of people. And Elizabeth protests and said, no, they were violently in love. And again, Mrs. Gardiner steps in with a sensibility here, which I think Elizabeth doesn't yet have. She says, "That expression of violently in love is so hackneyed, so doubtful, so indefinite, that it gives me very little idea. It is as often applied to feelings which arise from a half-hour's acquaintance as to a real strong attachment." Whenever we speak about somebody being violently in love or passionately in love, it may be that that type of love is also passionately driven out of them. Remember Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. It's often seen as this great love story, but really it's a story about people falling violently in love and not controlling themselves, not having any kind of governing over their passions, and consequently they end up killing each other or killing themselves. In this story, Bingley has no governance over himself. Consequently, he's passionately in love one minute and passionately out of love the next. This is also what Darcy has noticed, and what Darcy has tried to refrain from doing. He has noticed that Bingley falls in and out of love quickly, and he himself, although falling in love with Elizabeth, has tried to restrain that love. So in this conversation, Mrs. Gardiner, in some ways, is confirming the character of Mr. Darcy. Further on in the text, we notice that Mrs. Gardiner actually has a connection to Mr. Wickham. Remember, Wickham is the character who uses women. He's a player. He knows exactly what to say, what to do, what to wear in order to attract women. And he uses women and throws them away when he's done with them. But Mrs. Gardiner, who is judging him as a character all the time, sits down at a party with him and notices that she has a connection with him. The text says, "To Mrs. Gardiner, Wickham had one means of affording pleasure, unconnected with his general powers. About 10 or a dozen years ago, before her marriage, she had spent a considerable time in that part of Derbyshire to which he belonged. They had therefore many acquaintances in common, and though Wickham had been little there since the death of Darcy's father, it was yet in his power to give her fresher intelligence of her former friends than she had been in the way of procuring." This very judgment of Wickham that Mrs. Gardiner makes, then, she brings up in chapter 26. And she notices with Elizabeth that she has to be sensible, Elizabeth has to be sensible, and govern herself with control, sensibility. And she says to Elizabeth, You are too sensible a girl, Lizzie, to fall in love merely because you are warned against it, and therefore I am not afraid of speaking openly. Seriously, I would have you be on your guard. Do not involve yourself or endeavour to involve him, Wickham, in an affection which the want of fortune would make so very imprudent. I have nothing to say against him. He's a most interesting young man, and if he had the fortune he ought to have, I should think you could not do better. But as it is, you must not let your fancy run away with you. You have sense, and we all expect you to use it. Your father would depend on your resolution and good conduct, I am sure. Mrs. Gardiner is counseling her to basically be sensible about this. Wickham can't get married because he has no money. She doesn't know the character of Wickham yet, but she knows that having no money might drive a certain type of man to do things or say things that maybe he ought not to say or do. And Elizabeth then is able to admit she doesn't really love Wickham, that actually she just seems to have been flattered by him. She says, at present, I'm not in love with Mr. Wickham. No, I certainly am not. But he is beyond all comparison the most agreeable man I ever saw. And if he becomes really attached to me, I believe it would be better that he should not. I see the imprudence of it. Elizabeth sees that she's not in love with him, and that it would be imprudent to be in love with a man because he has no money. But so far she doesn't know any other men that are decent, good men. And this is where her bitterness is increasing, because she sees nobody else but Wickham. And Wickham's a rather poor catch because he has no money at all. And that can be a real burden, especially in this society where money is such an important factor. Well, later on, she finds that Wickham's impartiality to her has subsided. And he himself has basically given his heart, so to speak, to another woman. That woman has a great deal of money. And at the end of this chapter, we find out, as it says, that his apparent partiality has subsided. His attentions were over. He was the admirer of someone else. Elizabeth was watchful enough to see it all, but she could see it and write of it without material pain. Her heart had been slightly touched, and her vanity was satisfied with believing that she would have been his only choice had fortune permitted it. The sudden acquisition of £10,000 was the most remarkable charm of the young lady to whom he was now rendering himself agreeable. This Miss King, whom Wickham goes to marry, has £10,000 a year, which is the most important thing about her, not her intelligence or her looks or her grace. It's her fortune. And Wickham is marrying primarily for money. Elizabeth, being aware of this, sees that it's probably a good thing that he does this, and she lets him go. What she doesn't do is she doesn't judge him for doing something wrong, where she does judge Collins and she does judge Charlotte severely. She doesn't judge Wickham, partly because he had flattered her so much. And we end this section with her basically suggesting that she's dissatisfied with the world, but she now is beginning to see that there is a certain level of sensibility, practicality, and self-control that's absolutely vital in any relationship.